We've covered Marowak on this channel before, and the patrons must have wanted more bone-crushing action because they have requested none other than Cubone. It is famously one of the most morose Pokemon, known for hiding its face with its deceased Marowak mother's skull. Its sadness is such that it attacks with its handheld bone and cries with the same ferocity. In fact, the second episode of Pokemon Origins is such a tearjerker that it makes your favorite sad movie look like a lighthearted, upbeat comedy in comparison. One even saw this lonely sadness in Pikachu's Vacation, where Cubone was the only one who didn't want to help Charizard get unstuck from the tire, though thankfully it eventually came around. Today we'll see if Cubone was able to channel its sadness and rage into competitive success. And so, we ask, how good was Cubone actually? And in this video we'll be going over these competitive formats. Cubone wasn't used at all in RBY. Marowak was unable to find any viability even in NU, as it didn't hit too hard and was slammed by the special attacks flying around everywhere. That was fine though, since Cubone was not a fully evolved Pokemon, but Little Cup was not played in Generation 1. Fortunately, it made a quick turnaround in Generation 2, whose addition of held items made all of the difference. Little Cup was still not played, but that didn't stop Cubone, who now wielded the same thick club that launched Marowak to OU. The prospect of finding a place in the lower tiers was far from a guarantee though, as UU was beyond this reach. The stats of the tier staples were still simply too much for Cubone to deal with. It wasn't quite strong enough to smash through everything as effectively as it needed to compensate for its lack of defensive utility. Fortunately, Cubone was able to find a genuine niche in the tier below, NU. Now, it was still not entirely free of its burden of low stats. However, it no longer had its UU problem. In the NU environment, it was strong enough to smash through everything with the right support. It was the definition of a specialized Pokemon, meaning to call it difficult to fit in on teams was an understatement. But it bore such devastating game-winning potential that certain teams found it worthwhile to dedicate themselves to supporting it. This support came in the form of a teammate like Ledion, Farfetch, or rarely even Ariados using agility, then baton passing the boost against a Pokemon that would allow Cubone to set up its sword stance. This was a tall task given Cubone's frailty, but it was surprisingly feasible to get to work. Thanks to Cubone's great base defense, it could set up in the face of several popular physical attackers like Stantler. For this reason, Cubone was the premier agility recipient on baton pass teams. If its multi-step setup was pulled off successfully, Cubone would often end games on the spot, as with +2 attack, it one-hit KO'd almost the entire tier. And since agility meant they could no longer be outsped, the opponent would usually be forced to watch helplessly as they were swept by none other than Cubone. The few Pokemon that could survive a +2 Cubone assault, like the massively bulky Azumarill, could be pushed into KO range by spikes, which also sealed the deal on fellow wall Wigglytuff, who was already likely to be KO'd from full. Plus, since it only needed Earthquake and Rock Slide to devastate the entire metagame after a boost, Cubone could fit Substitute in its last move slot, allowing it to dodge would-be roadblocks such as Pinecow's Explosion and status like Gloom's Stun Spore. Agility pass teams had their issues, of course. Common Pokemon like Haze Weezing could shut them down. Dugtrio posed a large threat. They also struggled if a setup normal type like Swords Dance Lickitung or Curse Stantler or Wigglytuff got going before they did. And of course, they banked heavily on passing boosts to something as frail as Cubone. However, despite these issues, agility pass teams were used for a reason. Enabling Cubone's unmatched destructive potential was absolutely worthwhile, and it thrashed many a team into submission. Cubone wasn't able to find usage outside of agility pass, as it couldn't rectify its speed issues with paralysis support like Marowak did in OU, since it had such poor bulk, meaning it couldn't switch in nearly as much as it needed and was thus outclassed in such a role by Pokemon like Kingler, who also had the benefit of holding leftovers. Nevertheless, Cubone Tomahawk split many teams right down the middle. Cubone basically skipped Generation 3, as the loss of maxed out EVs across the board made its frailty too much to deal with, leaving it unable to find a niche in NU, while Little Cup was still not played competitively. But things turned around in Generation 4 though. Now power creep had resulted in Marowak dropping to NU, so Cubone stood no chance there. However, that was just fine, as Little Cup finally started to be played competitively, and there Cubone had a legitimate niche. Of course, it required support to make up for its low speed, a flaw that was particularly glaring alongside Cubone's inability to hold Oran Berry, which meant it had a tougher time taking hits than most other Pokemon, even with its nice defense stat. It also struggled to unleash the full power of its Stab Earthquake, as many of the tier's best most popular Pokemon could switch into it freely, most notably Gligar, Ghastly, Duskull, Drifloon, and Bronzor. Make no mistake though, Cubone was an utterly ferocious Pokemon. Its Earthquake would drop anything that wasn't resistant or immune, even the massively bulky best Pokemon in the tier, Munchlax, which was astonishing for a move that wasn't close combat or explosion. It was simply threatening to the monstrously bulky Wynot as well. Sure, Earthquake had plenty of immunities as well as resistances, such as Snover, but this was where Cubone's coverage came in. Fire Punch dealt massive damage to nearly everything that could take EQ, and was especially vicious with extra damage support from Stealth Rock. The one exception was Gligar, who was torn apart by Cubone's Ice Beam. Plus, even if Cubone wasn't good at taking multiple hits, it was quite good at taking at least one. Even Ghastly's Life Orb Shadow Ball wouldn't KO it after Stealth Rock. This gave it plenty of opportunities to at least break a hole in the opponent's core, helping its teammates clean up more easily. Cubone was particularly devastating if it predicted the opponent's switch. For example, if Bronzor switched in on an Earthquake aimed at Munchlax, then pivoted out to a Water type on the attempted Fire Punch, then Cubone wouldn't have done very much. However, all this was for naught if Cubone led off with the Fire Punches that hit so many of its switches. This strategy was useful for maximizing Cubone's efficiency in general, but was particularly valuable under Trick Room, in which Cubone's low speed was turned to its advantage and allowed it to go nearly unchallenged and threatening to KO multiple Pokemon. It wasn't difficult to set up Trick Room either, with how great setters like Porygon and Slowpoke were, and Cubone had an easy time switching into the litany of Thunderbolts flying around the tier. Cubone could also be supported in other ways, but Baton Pass strategies were gimmicky, and it was difficult to successfully paralyze enough of the opponent's team for it to be worthwhile. So Trick Room was the most reliable, and indeed Trick Room almost never went without Cubone. It was the playstyle's primary boon. Cubone's flaws meant it wasn't as easy to use as the tier staples, but it made up for this with its peerless power. There was no Pokemon more rewarding for the trainer who liked to make predictions and watch the opposing team drop in one hit. As such, Cubone had its own unique place in Generation 4 Little Cup. Generation 5's addition of Eviolite was a huge blow to Cubone. Suddenly, it was no longer the one-hit KO machine that it so needed to be, and it was now among the frailest Pokemon in the tier. These traits, in conjunction with its appalling speed, were a death sentence. There was no reason to go to massive efforts of supporting Cubone with Trick Room or Baton Pass or Paralysis, when one could just take the much easier route of setting up Sand with Hippopotas and using Drillbur instead. Even after Sand Rush was banned, Drillbur was a much better overall Pokemon than Cubone thanks to Eviolite, Rapid Spin, and decent speed. Before, Cubone had been worth the effort necessary to compensate for its flaws because it threatened to splatter everything in the game. But when it didn't even have that, there was absolutely no reason to use it. And thus, nobody did. Generation 6 was even rougher on Cubone with the buffing of Knockoff, which became one of the most spammed moves in the tier. And this doesn't necessarily sound so bad at first. Doesn't that mean less Eviolite for Cubone to deal with? Especially since Cubone could use Knockoff itself? In a nutshell, sure, but keep in mind that Knockoff being everywhere also meant Cubone was constantly at risk of losing its Thick Club. And if that happened, it wasn't going to be threatening even those Pokemon without Eviolite. It just wasn't worth this dance in addition to the Paralysis or Trick Room support Cubone needed so badly. Plus, there was still the major issue of Drillbur's continued existence, a Pokemon which did not require the support Cubone did, and was instead immediately useful while also providing support Cubone did not, and not becoming completely useless if it had its Eviolite knocked off. Cubone's extensive list of shortcomings meant it needed to provide some serious benefits to justify its inclusion on a team, especially with Drillbur around, but it had no such benefits. The closest thing it could do was use Bone Meringue to break through Focus Sashes and Sturdy, but it was not anywhere near enough to propel it to even a tiny niche, and as such, it was never ever used. For some reason, Cubone did not receive an awesome Alolan form like its evolution Marowak did in Generation 7, which is a real shame. A Fire Ghost Alolan Cubone would have been awesome, at least design-wise, and it likely would have found some sort of niche. It wouldn't need to be shielded from Knockoff any more than it already was, and it would gain a nifty Arena Trap immunity by virtue of its Ghost typing, as well as a ferociously spammable Stab combination. For example, popular Dark Resist Vullaby and Pawniard wouldn't want to take Shadow Bone lest they get smashed by Flare Blitz. Sadly, it got nothing of the sort, and instead toiled in obscurity once again, unable to find any sort of niche whatsoever. Even Drillbur struggled as Mudbray emerged as the tier's premier utility ground type, so Cubone really stood no chance. If there was a Little Cup equivalent of untiered, that's where Cubone would have gone for the 3rd generation in a row. Fortunately, Little Cup is not that cruel. Yes, that is Cubone's highlight for the generation and the 2 prior generations. Untiered not existing in Little Cup. It's been the same sad story in Generation 8. In a Little Cup swarming with Knockoff, more reliable ground types, and faster Pokemon, the Eviolite lacking Cubone was unable to establish any sort of meaningful niche for itself. Its inability to switch in, and inability to KO things as quickly as it needed to, coalesced into a morose Parasong, soundtracking Cubone's would-be descent to an untiered placement once again. Were the Little Cup landscape not one of unconditional support? Thank goodness for that. At least it's the nicest quirk of going level 5 over level 100. And that's it. So how good was Cubone actually? Well, Cubone started out with a unique, interesting niche as a bone-breaking baton pass recipient of agility boost, allowing it to rip entire teams apart. It then had another unique niche as a powerful bruiser in the first ever competitive Little Cup metagame in Generation 4. Sadly, that was the last time it's seen any sort of competitive use. Ever since Generation 5 with the introduction of Eviolite, it has been completely unable to find even the slightest semblance of a viability in the tier. And Generation 6's buffing of knockoff ensured it would stay that way. Still, it's not often you see a Pokemon with such a low base stat total succeed in any NU, much less succeed by sweeping entire teams, and it retains a niche in the most fast-paced Little Cup metagame to date. And as such, despite the shortcomings, Cubone's had an interesting competitive career. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Cubone? How would you buff it so that it does something in Little Cup? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.